Hey guys, what is happening? Carter here. We're going to be talking about frame locks versus liner locks. Which one? No, not which one's better. Just a discussion. Let's hang out. Let's talk about frame locks versus liner locks. We'll meander around a few different topics. We'll talk about maybe a little bit of history, not like specific history, right? I'm not here to recite facts; those are all available, but kind of where frame locks and liner locks came from. Yeah, we'll touch on that to start with. So we've got a few different examples here. Spyderco Paramilitary 2. I get a lot of questions when people are like, what's this knife? What's that knife? And I sometimes forget that people don't always know what's what. So let's do just what these are. Background candy here. I'll use these for the discussion. Only one frame lock here. You know what? Let's swap this out. Let's swap this one out and throw in an Evo 3 for the frame lock. Okay, so we've got a Paramilitary 2 here. This one is in, what steel? Crewware, DLC blade, beautiful purple scales. This one is a liner lock, but it is a compression lock, subtype of liner lock. So it's still a liner, just the lock is on the back instead of the front. That's a whole different topic. Really innovative. I wish this was more prevalent. Spyderco has the licensing for it, so you have to get licensed through them, and I guess, I don't know if it's hard or expensive. Not a lot of people do it, which is a shame. Here we've got a CKF Custom Knife Factory. I always mess that up. Custom Knife Factory Evo 3. This is a frame lock. Really cool knife there. This is an Emerson Mini Commander with some teeth on there, thunderstorm finish. You know what's up. This is a liner lock, traditional Walker liner lock. And then here we have a Arcane Design Abyss, which is a frame lock. So let's start with kind of history, not specifics, not details, just general stuff. So the liner lock was invented by Mr. Walker. I forget his first name. He's a custom knife maker. Well, actually, it's not really invented by him. So the liner lock goes way back, right? Mr. Walker, some would say perfected or fine-tuned the liner lock. Basically, his biggest contribution was that he included the detent ball on the liner lock with the detent hull. Prior to that, there really wasn't a detent, right? You just have to tighten the pivot down so that the blade didn't fall open. There wasn't a detent system per se. So he added that to the liner lock as well as did some other tweaks to it. But the liner lock is, who knows who truly invented it. Those go way back to knives hundreds of years ago. But Mr. Walker, I think in the 80s, kind of took that design, tweaked it, and so he's been associated with it ever since. So Emerson, for example, reached out to him and said, can I use your system on my knives? And he said yes. And so Emerson is an official blessed version of the liner lock. Other makers kind of just do it, right? It's gotten to the point where, kind of like Band-Aids, right? Everybody calls adhesive bandages Band-Aids, even though technically Band-Aid is a brand name. And even legally, once it gets to a point where it's so commonly referred to as something and so commonly used, you kind of lose your ability to legally own it. And that's kind of how the liner lock is, unfortunately. Some people give Mr. Walker credit on it. Most people don't, and people just kind of use it now. It's just so common, you don't think twice. Frame lock was invented by Chris Reeve, Sebenza. I don't know if a lot of people know that. It's so common now. The idea that it didn't exist, and that one can be traced more specifically to him. I mean, he came up with the concept, right? And a lot of it was enabled by materials. Once titanium became available and machining ability became available, all of a sudden a frame lock became possible. Prior to that, frame locks were just not really something you could do. We didn't have the machining commonly available to machine big slabs of titanium, and titanium was expensive and harder to get. So, some of that was Mr. Reeve kind of coming up with the idea. Some of it, though, was that, capabilities, right, made that possible. So I guess what I'm saying is, had he not invented it, somebody else would have pretty soon after, I'm pretty sure of. So those are the two kind of main, sorry, I had something in my throat. So those are kind of the two main lock systems we're talking about here. So what I want to discuss is kind of pros and cons and things like that. Spoiler alert, in my mind, there's no clear winner. I know some people would say, yeah, hands down, Framelock. Framelock is kind of a little bit of the favorite child right now and has been for a number of years, and potentially will be for a long time. I am curious to see if Framelocks ever go away, if they become truly antiquated. They're starting to kind of get that way. You know, a lot of people are looking at button locks and I don't even, bar locks, I guess you would call them, kind of like the Axis lock and the Ram lock from Microtech, and some of the others. Spyderco has some cool, the ball lock. Similar concept, right? Spring pushes something up behind the tang. So kind of like this concept in that it's locking more behind the lock face and the tang, but it's some sort of object, a ball or a bar, that gets pushed up via spring to move behind it. Spring is in coiled spring. Technically, you would call this a spring too. This is a spring. And in here, this is a spring too. But when I say spring, I'm really referring to like a coiled spring, like a bouncy boing boing, boing boing spring. Those are starting to show up more, but yeah, I'm curious to see if those completely take over the popularity of the knife world, or if frame locks and liner locks will truly go away. So here's the thing. Let's go through some topics, or let's go through top level, down level, frame lock versus liner lock. Weight. Let's talk weight. Which one is lighter? Neither, or both, or either. Depending on how it's implemented. There are very light frame locks. This one's heavy because it's full tie, right? It's full tie and doesn't have as much milling done to it. It's not as light as it could be. This one's kind of heavy because it has a stainless steel other liner lock. So it is kind of hard to say. I mean, it would be one of those things where you have to take like 2,000 versions of each and get an average weight to see which one on average weighs less, right? What I will say is I want to lean towards it's easier to make a liner lock lighter than a frame lock. Generally, not always, generally. Striders are pretty light, honestly. Like an S&G is pretty light. But, you know, a lot of these knives, you have to do a lot of work milling in here to reduce the weight because frame locks generally are pretty thick and beefy. However, they don't have to be. I mean, you can do a thin frame lock. You know what I mean? You could technically have a frame lock that is just this thick. I mean, it'd be kind of weird. It wouldn't be very comfortable, but you could do it. So it's a hard one to answer. I would say it's sixes. It depends on how it's implemented. There's a lot of factors that go into it. Frame locks can be super light. Liner locks can be super light. So that is what it is. Let's talk now safety. Which one is safer? Which one is a stronger lock? Once again, very difficult. The benefit of the frame lock is that you can use the force of your hand to keep this lock engaged. So as you grip this, you are putting extra force on this lock onto the lock face. On this, you don't do that, right? Your hand isn't squeezing that lock at all. The lock has to do what it does. So because of that fact, I will side towards frame locks being a little safer, and not because these can't be. I would just say liner locks have to be done really, really correctly in order for it to be 100% safe. Frame locks you can get away with more because of this fact, right? You can have a pretty shoddy frame lock, but because you're gripping it, it's gonna keep it locked up. If you do a shoddy liner lock, you're just screwed, right? It's just not gonna work and it's gonna fail. So there is less room for error on a frame lock, in my opinion, than the liner lock. Now, that being said, if they're both 100% correctly implemented, I would say they're equal. There's some benefits to liner locks. I've talked about this before. If you engineer it correctly, the way the force angles, it's actually going to push this liner against this scale and bend this liner as opposed to trying to shoot it off. With a frame lock, you don't get that flex. You don't get that flex at all. And so all that force coming down is just going to want to push this over if the engineering, if the angling is not done correctly. And this was something that was more debatable years ago. Believe it or not, 15 years ago, frame locks weren't completely dialed in, you know, and machining wasn't as precise. And so you'd get frame locks and there was a higher instance of them slipping and failing and not sticking. So things are better now. A lot easier to get these angles 100% correct. So more or less sixes, but I would lean towards the Framelock to say, yeah, Framelock's generally easier to get away with because there's more margin for error there. So let's do another subjective one. Let's do looks. Which one looks better? Well, that's up to you. There's pros and cons. For a long time, just kind of seeing this with the chunky titanium was just such a treat. It was so new and not something people were used to seeing. It was so exciting. Now it's more common and not as striking as it used to be, but it still is cool. So it gives you the option to do a lot of cool stuff with titanium, and there's something about kind of working with metal, having an all-metal knife, some of the stuff you can do with it, that's really cool. However, on Linerlocks, you also have a lot of different options in terms of the scales you use. Natural, micarta, all kinds of G10, inlays, all kinds of things you can do with these. You also have the ability to more easily and cheaply swap out scales in the look, right? It's easy to get different scales made that you can swap out. With a Framelock, you might be able to do that with the front side, depending, but the back side, you're not really, there's not really a secondary market for aftermarket frames, right? You don't swap out frames. It's too expensive. Nobody's making a different frame for this knife that you can just swap out. Now you can send it in and they can take this off and anodize it or sand it or do different finishes on it, but you're not really going to have multiple Framelocks to swap out on a knife generally. Nobody does that. It's just too much. This is expensive. It's a lot of titanium. In order to get this to work, you have to do a lot of milling work, like mill out this pocket here. On this Linerlock, you don't have to do that, right? It's much cheaper. This liner is much cheaper. So that's pretty subjective, right? Personally, I would lean towards Framelock. I like the look of titanium still, even though it's so common. Something about the titanium just kind of gets me. But I can't deny some of the stuff you can do with Linerlocks and how it's much cheaper. For example, I've got two Emersons. This one here, the 15. I've got a set of scales coming in. Relatively inexpensive, two-side scales, and then I'm going to have dual. I could swap them out. I could be like, yeah, I'm going to run stock black ones, or I'm going to run the gray ones, or I could get some micarta ones. I could swap them out, and you can really change up the appearance of the same knife. Whereas this one, I would have to send it in to somebody to pimp it, or I'd have to do it myself, stone wash or something. Much more expensive, time-consuming, and permanent, right? I'm not going to order different scales for this. If I wanted something with a completely different look, I would have to buy a whole nother knife, which is a lot of money. Swap this out just for funsies. So, sixes, but I would lean towards the general look of titanium. However, there's so many benefits to the Linerlock. Let's do ease of use. So this is a big one for me. I've got relatively big hands, or at least long spread, right? I don't have sausage fingers, but I do have a pretty good hand width, not record breaking, but pretty large, long fingers. One of the problems I have with Framelocks is keeping my fingers off of the frame. Now for flippers, not that big of a deal generally, and for doing spider flicking, not that big of a deal, but I have knives that I cannot, like this one, I can't open it with my thumb without really contorting my hand. I've got to get my fingers onto the clip and onto the frame. Otherwise, I'm exerting too much force onto the detent ball, right? Because you got to remember the detent's in here, and my fingers, my big grubby fingers, are pushing on this Framelock bar, and it can make it hard to open. Now, it depends on the knife. Larger knives, I don't have that much of a problem with. This one, I can get enough of my fingers off of there that it's not a big deal, and I can flip this open. I can use it with my thumb. It also depends on how tuned the detent is, how strong the detent inherently is. This one's fairly light. The Evos are not super strong detents, so I don't have that problem, but it's mainly because I have enough real estate here. Some knives, like the Anax, the Microtech Anax, and I would suspect a Framelock that I just ordered that'll be here soon, I cannot open with my thumb. I just can't do it. It's not a way I can open the knife. With Linerlocks, you don't have that problem, right? Because you're not exerting any force onto that frame. So it is not an issue at all. It's completely not an issue. You can open these however you want to open them, and it doesn't matter either way. Other factors will matter, right? But not squeezing on the lock bar, because you don't interact with the lock bar. So most of the time it's a non-issue for me on knives, but when it does rear its head, when I get a knife and I can't open it with my thumb, it is annoying. Really bugs me, especially if it's a knife that's kind of good for slow opening. So here's another example, Military 2. No problem opening this knife any which way that you can open it, because I'm not squeezing on that lock bar. But some of these others, even this one, I can tell it's harder for me to open it with my thumb because I'm squeezing on that detent, even just a little bit. It doesn't take much. Just having a minor amount of pressure will affect that detent, and depending on how the detent's tuned, it can mean you can't actually open the knife. So on that front, I will give it to the Linerlock because you don't run into that issue. The next one, I think we're about even here. I probably should be keeping score, and I'm going way too long on this video. But the other one I want to say is, and I don't hear a lot of people talk about it, grip. Grip, and this is actually a really good example here. Titanium is slick. It's metal, it's slick. And depending on how you do it, it can be more or less slick. Sandblasting gives it a little bit of grit. This one here is bead blasted. It's very, very slick. Slick on both sides. This one has some texturing, but it's still pretty slick. In fact, every example, so this is sandblasted, I think, and you get a little more grip, but not that much. Because any sort of texture has to be milled or grooved into this, and that's very expensive, and you're limited on how much you can do. The Emerson, extremely grippy. Most people say too grippy. It has a lot of grip, and it's both sides. So you could say, well, you can do a liner on this side, and you can do grip on this side. That's true. But this side's always going to be a titanium Framelock. It's always going to be slick. It would have been cool to get a Framelock example in here that wasn't full tie. I realize every single one of my Framelocks I brought down for this video are full titanium both sides. But you can obviously put G10 or whatever you want on this side. But this side's always going to be slick. With the Linerlock, you can have both sides fully textured. And when you're talking about getting a grip on the knife, it is rock solid. This one, this DLC'd one of my biggest complaints with this, and why I sold my first one, this is actually the second one I've had, looks very striking and it's cool, but it is so slippery. And it's got grooves and stuff, so I'm not really worried about it slipping out of my hand. But when I pull it out of my pocket and I'm grabbing it, I do kind of worry because it gets really slick. And if you get any kind of oil or liquid on here, this thing is like a banana. It is not grippy at all. Looks really cool, but no gripability. And so for us little knife hobbyists, where I carry this out to dinner, no big deal. But for people that really use their knives on job sites and things like that, something like this makes way more sense, and it's way more practical. You get double grip on both sides. So I think those are all the main points I wanted to discuss. And like I said at the beginning, it's not a slam dunk. There's not one that's like, oh, this is better, that's better. There's pros and cons to both. Some of it depends on preference. Some of it depends on your use case. Some of it I think is hype-ish, right? I kind of think Framelocks have been riding a little bit of a hype wave for a long time now, where people just inherently think they're better. And that's not necessarily the case. And I'll see that in comments, right? Some comments people state where they're just like so firmly believe that Linerlocks are garbage. And it's like, well, no, not necessarily. It's not. They're not garbage, right? There's pros and cons, and there's different ways to look at it. But I think we've gotten to the point where people just think Linerlocks are just old school, and there's no benefit to them, and there's no reason other than cost to choose a Linerlock over a Framelock. And I don't agree with that at all. In fact, I would like to see Linerlocks kind of come back in vogue. I think they have their place, and they have a lot of benefits. So, all right, that's it. Let me know down below. Do you have a preference either way? I'm sure most people are team Framelock, but do you have any other insights that I've missed to say why actually a Framelock is better as opposed to just, I like it and I think it's cooler, and there's cooler knives? Because that's the other thing. Don't let that cloud you. So because this is a more popular locking system right now, you're going to see more knives that use it. And so you're inherently going to be like, well, there's just cooler knives that are Framelocks. That doesn't matter, right? And we saw that with the Trizula from CKF, right? It's a Linerlock, I believe. The Eagle Rock, am I mistaken? I think it's a Linerlock. So it's possible to make cool Linerlocks. So don't let the fact that I'm using an Emerson to illustrate say, well, Emersons are not my thing, and they're kind of a little crude in their construction, so therefore I'm going to say that Linerlocks suck. Linerlocks can be as cool and as fancy as people want them to be. I'm talking mainly the actual system themselves. Any opinions you have on that, any insight as to why, anything I missed, let me know down below. Appreciate you watching if you made it this far, and I'll see you on the next one. See you guys.